The dust tasted of shame. It coated Elura's tongue, a gritty film that was the flavor of rock bottom. It settled in the folds of her worn calico dress, a dress her husband, Thomas, had once said made her eyes look like the summer sky. Now, it was a shroud of humiliation, clinging to her thin frame as she stood on the crude wooden platform in the center of Prosperity Creek. Her son, Leo, just 5 years old, clutched her leg, his small face buried in her skirt, his tiny body trembling. Like a trapped bird. The sun beat down with a merciless biblical fury, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the very hope from the ground. The faces staring up at her were a blur of sweat-sheened curiosity and grim satisfaction. They were her neighbors, the people who had shared bread at her wedding and offered condolences at Thomas's funeral just 6 months prior. Now they watched as if she were livestock. Because in a way, she was. Silas Blackwood, her late husband's uncle and the town's self-appointed elder, stood beside her, his voice a gravelly proclamation of her ruin. "A woman alone is a burden on this community," he declared, his words carrying over the murmuring crowd. "Debts must be paid." Thomas, bless his soul, was not a careful man. A lie. Thomas had been the most careful of men, but a sudden fever had taken him, leaving Elara defenseless against Silas's greed. He had produced ledgers filled with phantom debts, forged signatures, and declared their small mortgaged homestead forfeit. But that wasn't enough. He wanted to crush her spirit, to make an example of her. "So we offer a solution in the spirit of Christian charity," Silas boomed, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "A wife, a worker, for the man who will take on her husband's debt and provide for her and the boy." It was not an auction of flesh, not in name, but the stench of it was the same. Men sized her up, their eyes lingering on her form, calculating her worth in terms of acres cleared and meals cooked. She could feel their gazes like physical blows, stripping away the last vestiges of her dignity. Leo whimpered, a small heartbroken sound that tore through Elara's soul. She placed a hand on his head, her fingers stroking his fine sun-bleached hair. "Be strong," she told herself, a silent, desperate prayer. "Do not let them see you break." She focused on a point beyond the town, on the distant, hazy line of the mesas, their purple shadows a stark contrast to the scorched earth. That was where she and Thomas had dreamed of going, to a place where the land was wild and free, a place where a family could carve out a life on their own terms. Now that dream was a ghost, mocking her from the horizon. $50, a voice called out. It was Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, a decent man, but his wife stood beside him, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. He was bidding out of pity, and pity felt like another layer of dirt on her skin. $75, another voice crowed. Elara recognized it as Bartholomew Sterling, the town banker. He was a portly man with moist, piggy eyes and a reputation for foreclosing on widows. He licked his lips as he stared at her, and a wave of nausea washed over Elara. She pulled Leo closer, her body a fragile shield. She would rather starve in the wilderness than share a roof with that man. She could feel the panic rising in her throat, hot and suffocating. Her gaze swept the crowd one last time, a desperate, silent plea for a savior who was not there. The faces were a sea of indifference. These were people hardened by the frontier, people who had learned to look away from the suffering of others to protect their own fragile hold on survival. And then she saw him. He was not part of the crowd, but stood apart, leaning against the weathered post of the general store's porch, half hidden in the shadows. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and leather, his hat pulled low, obscuring his face. He was a silhouette of a man, a ghost at the edge of her nightmare. There was a stillness about him that was different from the fidgety energy of the other men. He wasn't looking at her like she was a piece of property. He was just watching. His presence was a quiet, unnerving question mark in the suffocating certainty of her fate. $100. Sterling bellowed, stepping forward, his chest puffed out. $100 for the widow and her boy. A generous offer to unburden this town. Silas grinned, his yellowed teeth flashing. $100 from Mr. Sterling, a fine, upstanding man. Do I hear any other offers? Going once. Elura's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The end of her life, the beginning of a new servitude. She closed her eyes, her hand tightening on Leo's head. She prayed for the earth to swallow her whole, for a sudden storm to wash this whole wretched town away. She prayed to Thomas, a silent, agonized scream into the void. Forgive me, I couldn't keep him safe, going twice. Silas's voice was a death knell. A shadow fell over her. The man from the porch had moved. He walked not to the front of the crowd, but directly to the steps of the platform, his boots scuffing softly in the thick dust. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded attention. The murmuring of the crowd died down, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and pushed back the brim of his hat. His face was not handsome in the way Thomas had been. It was a landscape of harsh lines and old pains, carved by sun and sorrow. A faded scar ran from his temple down his cheek, a pale white river through his tanned skin. But his eyes were a clear, startling gray, the color of a stormy sky, and they held a depth of stillness that seemed to absorb all the frantic energy around them. They met Elura's, and for a fleeting second, she felt not pity, but a flicker of something else, recognition, as if he saw not just the shamed widow on the block, but the woman inside. He did not look at Silas or Sterling. He spoke to her, his voice low and steady, yet it carried across the silent square like the toll of a distant bell. He's not buying you, the man said, his gaze unwavering. He's buying your shame. Sterling sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. Who in the hell are you to interrupt a legal transaction? The stranger ignored him. His eyes remained on Elura. I have no money to bid, he said, his voice raw with an honesty that was more valuable than all of Sterling's gold. My land is poor. My cabin is half built. I have nothing to offer you but my name, and my word that no man will ever put a price on you again. He paused, and the silence stretched, taut and fragile. I'll offer you freedom, he said. The words simple, yet they landed with the force of a revelation, a partnership. We raise your boy together. We work the land together. You owe me nothing but your own 2 hands. And you'll be your own woman, under your own roof. He extended a hand, not to help her down, but as an offering. It was a calloused, scarred hand, the hand of a man who knew hardship intimately. My name is Caleb Thorne. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Elura stared at his outstretched hand, then at his face. He was offering her a choice, a thing she thought she had lost forever. It was an insane proposal, a leap of faith into an unknown wilderness with a man who was a complete stranger. But the alternative was Sterling's leering face, Silas's triumphant cruelty, a life of indentured misery. She looked down at Leo, who peeked out from her skirt, his wide, tear-filled eyes fixed on the stranger. Caleb's gaze softened as he looked at the boy, a flicker of some deep, buried pain crossing his features. In that moment, Elura knew. This was not a rescue, it was a different kind of survival. A gamble, but one where she held at least one card. She took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs, and for the first time that day, it did not taste of shame. It tasted of a terrifying, exhilarating possibility. She let go of Leo's head and took a step forward, her bare foot meeting the rough-hewn wood of the platform. Then, slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in Caleb's. His grip was firm, warm, and steady. It felt less like a transaction and more like an anchor in a raging sea. He did not pull her down. He simply held her hand, a silent vow passing between them, witnessed by the stunned and silent town. The rich man had tried to buy her body, but the poor cowboy, with nothing but dust on his boots and ghosts in his eyes, had just offered her back her soul. The journey to Caleb's land was a silent one. He had procured a tired-looking mule from the livery, setting Leo in front of him on his own horse, a sturdy roan that seemed as quiet and resilient as its owner. Ilara rode the mule, her back straight, her hands clutching the reins with a white-knuckled grip. She did not look back at Prosperity Creek. To look back was to acknowledge the life that had been stolen from her, the grave of her husband, the ashes of her dreams. She could only look forward into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the frontier, toward a future that was a complete and terrifying mystery. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, but Ilara felt none of its beauty. She felt only the rhythmic plodding of the mule, the creak of leather, and the immense, crushing weight of the silence between herself and the man who had claimed her. Caleb's ranch, if it could be called that, was nestled in a small, forgotten valley, cradled by low-slung hills dotted with juniper and sage. It was less a homestead and more a scar on the landscape. The cabin was a skeletal structure of rough-hewn logs, with a patched roof and gaping holes where windows were meant to be. A half-finished corral stood nearby, its posts leaning at weary angles. The land itself was rocky and overgrown, choked with weeds and stubborn brush. It was a place of profound loneliness, a testament to a long and losing battle against the wilderness. This was the freedom he had offered her, a share in his desolation. A bitter laugh threatened to escape her lips, but she swallowed it down. She had made her choice. Now she had to live with it. Caleb dismounted and lifted a sleeping Leo from the saddle, his movements gentle and surprisingly deft. He carried the boy into the cabin without a word. Ilara slid off the mule, her legs stiff and sore. She stood for a moment, taking in the scene, the twilight casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the emptiness in her own heart. She had traded one prison for another, a public cage for a private one. The inside of the cabin was even more stark than the outside. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center. A cot with a thin patched blanket was pushed against one wall. The floor was packed earth, and the air was thick with the smell of dust, old smoke, and something else. A deep, abiding sorrow. Caleb had laid Leo on the cot, covering him with the blanket. He was now stoking the embers in the fireplace, his back to her. "There's a well out back," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Water's clean. There's some jerky and hardtack in that crate." He gestured with his head toward a wooden box in the corner. He did not turn to look at her. It was as if he was already regretting his impulsive act, as if her presence was an intrusion he didn't know how to handle. Ilara's exhaustion warred with a rising tide of anger and despair. She had not eaten all day. Her body ached, and her heart was a raw, open wound. She wanted to scream at him, to demand to know what he expected of her, to rage at the injustice of it all. But what was the point? He had been honest. He had offered her nothing but a partnership in his poverty. She had accepted. The silence. In the cabin was a living thing, a third occupant that pressed in on them from all sides. It was filled with their unspoken fears, their shared brokenness. She found a bucket and went to the well. The water was cold and sweet, a small clean mercy in this desolate place. She drank deeply, then washed her face and hands, the cool water a balm on her hot skin. When she returned to the cabin, Caleb had a small fire going, its flickering light dancing on the rough log walls, making the shadows writhe and twist. He was sitting at the table, sharpening a knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape-scrape the only sound in the room. Ilara took some jerky and a piece of hardtack from the crate. She sat on one of the stools, as far away from him as the small table would allow. The jerky was tough and salty, and the hardtack was like chewing on a piece of wood, but it was food. She ate slowly, mechanically, her eyes on the fire. She could feel Caleb's gaze on her, but she refused to meet it. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her tears. Days bled into one another, each one a mirror of the last. They were two ghosts haunting the same house, their lives intersecting only in the shared tasks of survival. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a language of gestures and actions. He would leave a stack of firewood by the door in the morning. She would leave a plate of food on the table in the evening. He taught her how to set snares for rabbits, his large hands, guiding hers with an impersonal touch, his voice a low murmur as he explained the mechanics of the trap. She, in turn, took over the small vegetable patch he had abandoned, her fingers coaxing green shoots from the stubborn earth. She mended his torn shirts, her stitches small and neat, a silent act of domesticity in their strange, undomestic arrangement. Leo was the bridge between their two islands of silence. He was a child, and he did not understand the weight of unspoken words. He would follow Caleb around the yard, his small face a mask of hero worship as he watched the man chop wood or repair the corral. Caleb, for his part, was surprisingly patient with the boy. He never smiled, but the harsh lines of his face would soften when Leo was near. He carved a small wooden horse for the boy, its form rough but recognizable. He would answer Leo's endless stream of questions with a quiet gravity, his voice losing some of its flat, dead quality. One evening, as Ilara was washing the dishes, she saw Caleb teaching Leo how to skip stones on a small creek that ran behind the cabin. The setting sun cast them in a golden light, and for a moment they looked like a real father and son. A pang of something sharp and painful shot through Ilara's chest. It was a dangerous feeling, a flicker of hope in the darkness, and she quickly extinguished it. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. The nights were the hardest. Ilara slept on a pallet of straw and blankets she had made on the floor, while Caleb took the cot. The darkness was filled with the sounds of the wilderness, the chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf. But the loudest sound was the breathing of the man on the other side of the room. In the dark, he was not just a silent partner in survival. He was a man, a stranger, and she was a woman, alone and vulnerable. She would lie awake for hours, her body tense, her ears straining for any sound, any sign of a threat. But he never moved, never spoke. He just breathed, a steady, rhythmic presence in the dark. One afternoon, a storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple gray. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. The roof, which Caleb had been trying to patch, began to leak. Water dripped onto the floor, turning the packed earth to mud. Ilara rushed to move their meager supplies away from the leaks, her heart pounding with a familiar dread. It felt as if the world was trying to wash them away, to erase their small, fragile existence. Caleb climbed onto the roof in the heart of the storm, a hammer in his hand, his body a dark silhouette against the roiling sky. Ilara watched from the doorway, her hands clenched into fists, her breath catching in her throat as he fought against the wind and the rain. He was reckless, fearless, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear or resentment. It was a grudging respect. He was a fighter. He might be broken, but he was not beaten. When he finally came back inside, soaked to the skin and shivering, she did not say a word. She took a dry blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. She poured him a cup of hot water infused with the mint she had found growing by the creek. He took the cup, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. Their eyes met for a brief, unguarded moment. In his, she saw not just exhaustion, but a flicker of surprise, of gratitude. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the wall of silence. between them, but it was enough. The struggle was not just against the land. It was against the past. Alara was haunted by memories of Thomas, of the life they had planned, the laughter that had once filled their home. Caleb was haunted by ghosts of his own. She could see them in the way he stared into the fire at night, his face a mask of anguish. She could hear them in the nightmares that sometimes made him cry out in his sleep, a single choked word: Sarah. One day, while cleaning out a dusty corner of the cabin, she found a small, leather-bound book. It was a journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was neat, feminine. It was a woman's diary. Sarah's diary. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she shouldn't read it, that it was a violation of his privacy. But she couldn't help herself. She needed to understand the man who had saved her, the man whose sorrow was a palpable presence in their home. The diary told a story of love and hope, of a young couple who had come to this valley with dreams of building a life together. Sarah wrote of Caleb's strength, his gentleness, his quiet humor. She wrote of their plans for the cabin, for the children they hoped to have. The last entry was dated 2 years prior. It was short, frantic. The fever came so fast. He's burning up. I'm so scared. The baby. Alara closed the book, her hands shaking. She finally understood. Caleb had not just lost a wife. He had lost a child, too. He had lost his entire world in this very cabin. And he had been living with their ghosts ever since. Her own grief, which had felt so immense and all-consuming, suddenly seemed smaller, part of a larger shared human sorrow. She looked over at Caleb, who was outside, mending a fence, his back a straight, unyielding line. He was not just a silent, broken man. He was a man drowning in a sea of unspeakable pain. And in that moment, her heart broke for him. That evening, she did not retreat into her usual silence. She made a stew, a real stew, with rabbit and the vegetables from her garden. She set the table with 2 bowls and 2 spoons. When Caleb came in, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening in surprise. He looked at the table, then at her. "Sit," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Eat." He hesitated for a moment, then slowly he sat down. They ate in their usual silence, but this time it was different. It was not a silence of anger or mistrust. It was a silence of shared understanding, of 2 broken people acknowledging each other's pain without the need for words. When they finished, he looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick. It was the first time he had thanked her for anything. It was the first time he had truly seen her, not as a burden or a responsibility, but as a person. And in that small, simple moment, something shifted between them. The fragile bridge of trust they had been building, plank by painful plank, finally felt strong enough to walk on. The healing had begun, not with a grand gesture, but with a shared meal in a half-finished cabin, a quiet communion of 2 lonely, wounded souls. The town of Prosperity Creek did not forget them. Every few weeks, when their supplies ran low, the journey to the general store was an ordeal. The whispers followed them like a foul wind. "There's the bought woman," they'd mutter, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. "And the fool who took her." The women would pull their children closer, as if Alara's misfortune were a contagion. The men would stare at Caleb with a challenging glint in their eyes, as if daring him to defend his strange, unconventional arrangement. Mr. Sterling was the worst. He would stand on the porch of his bank, his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, a smug, proprietary look on his face. He would watch Elora as she moved through the store, his gaze a physical violation. He never spoke to her directly, but his presence was a constant, suffocating reminder of the life she had narrowly escaped. Silas, too, would make a point of being there, his eyes glittering with malice. He had lost his prize, and he would not let them forget it. He would make loud, pointed remarks about the folly of charity, and the burden of taking on another man's responsibilities. Caleb would stand by Ilara's side, his body a silent, unmovable wall. He never rose to their taunts, never acknowledged their insults. He would simply meet their gazes with his own steady, unnerving stare until they looked away, their bravado shriveling under the weight of his quiet intensity. He would pay for their supplies, flour, salt, coffee, with the few coins he earned. From selling pelts to a traveling trapper, his face a mask of grim determination. Ilara learned to hold her head high, to meet the stares of the townspeople with a cool, defiant dignity. She would look them straight in the eye, her expression unreadable, her posture erect. She was no longer the broken, weeping woman on the auction block. She was a survivor. She was Caleb Thorne's partner, and she would not let them shame her. Her defiance was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to be defined by their judgment. But the hostility was a constant, grinding pressure. It wore on her nerves, frayed the edges of her resolve. Some days she would return to the cabin and collapse onto her pallet, the weight of the town's scorn pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. On those days, Caleb would be quieter than usual. He wouldn't offer words of comfort. He was not a man of easy words, but he would do small things. He would make sure the water bucket was full. He would leave a piece of honeycomb on the table, a rare treat from a wild hive he had found. He would sit by the fire and carve, the rhythmic scrape of his knife a soothing, steady presence in the room. Not everyone in Prosperity Creek was hostile. There were small, flickering lights of kindness in the suffocating darkness of the towns. Judgment, Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's wife, who had looked so disapproving at the auction, began to leave a small bag of apples for them on the counter of the general store. She would never acknowledge the gift, but her eyes would meet Ilara's for a fleeting moment, a silent message of solidarity passing between them. The town doctor, a weary, kind-eyed man named Miller, once stopped Caleb in the street. "Your boy looks healthy," he said, nodding at Leo. "You're doing a good job, Thorne." It was a small thing, but it was a public acknowledgement of their legitimacy, a crack in the wall of the town's disapproval. One day, a traveling preacher set up a tent on the edge of town. His sermon was a fire and brimstone affair, full of condemnation for the sinners and the outcasts. He spoke of the sanctity of marriage, the shame of widows who did not honor their late husbands' memories, the folly of men who took in strays. His words were aimed at them, a public flogging disguised as a sermon. Ilara sat on the mule, her face pale, her hands trembling. She could feel the eyes of the entire town on them, their faces a mixture of righteous agreement and morbid curiosity. She expected Caleb to turn the horse and ride away, to retreat to the safety of their isolated valley. But he didn't. He dismounted, his face set like stone. He walked to the front of the crowd, his boots crunching on the dry grass. He did not look at the preacher. He looked at the faces of the townspeople. "This woman is my wife," he said, his voice ringing with a quiet authority that cut through the preacher's booming rhetoric. "This boy is my son. We are a family, and we will be respected as such." He turned and looked at Ilara, his gray eyes blazing with a protective fire she had never seen before. He held out his hand to her. "Come," he said. "Let's go." "Home." She slid off the mule and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. They walked through the silent, stunned crowd, their heads held high, Leo trailing behind them, his small hand clutching the back of Caleb's shirt. They did not look back. They did not need to. They had faced the town's judgment together, and they had not broken. They had forged their own definition of family, not in a church, but in the crucible of their shared struggle. The whispers did not stop overnight, but something had shifted. The town's judgment, which had once been a solid, unbreachable wall, now had cracks in it. The acts of kindness became more frequent, less furtive. A rancher offered Caleb a good price on a pregnant cow. The general store owner started setting aside the best cuts of meat for them. The women in the town began to nod at Alara, a grudging respect in their eyes. They were still outsiders, but they were no longer outcasts. They had earned their place, not by conforming, but by having the courage to be different. They had shown the town that a family was not something defined by blood or by law, but by love, loyalty, and the quiet dignity of a shared life. The first snow of winter fell early that year, a thick white blanket that transformed the harsh landscape into a place of stark, silent beauty. The world shrank to the four walls of their cabin, the crackling fire, and the sound of their breathing. The enforced intimacy of the winter months was a new kind of test. There was no escape from each other, no work in the fields to distract them from the unspoken things that lay between them. They developed a rhythm, a domestic dance of shared chores and quiet companionship. He would spend his days hunting, his tall frame disappearing into the white wilderness, returning at dusk with a rabbit or a grouse. She would spend her days cooking, mending, and teaching Leo his letters, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet cabin. They were like two planets orbiting the same sun, held together by an invisible force, their paths separate but intertwined. One night, a blizzard raged outside, the wind shrieking like a tormented spirit. Leo, who had been coughing for days, developed a fever. His small body was hot to the touch, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. Alara's blood ran cold. It was the same fever that had taken Thomas, the same fever that had taken Sarah and her baby. The past was not just a ghost. It was a predator circling their small, fragile home. She bathed Leo's forehead with cool water, her hands trembling. She tried to get him to drink some willow bark tea, but he was too weak. He just lay on the cot, his eyes glassy, his breathing a painful, rasping sound. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. She was going to lose him. She was going to lose everything. Caleb watched her, his face a mask of anguish. He saw the terror in her eyes, and he knew it was not just for Leo. It was for Thomas, for the life she had lost. He saw his own past reflected in her fear, the same helpless horror he had felt as he watched Sarah slip away. He had to do something. He could not let history repeat itself. "I'm going for the doctor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "No," Alara cried, her voice sharp with fear. "You can't. The blizzard. You'll never make it." Prosperity Creek was a day's ride in good weather. In this storm, it was a suicide mission. "I have to," he said, his gray eyes meeting hers. "I won't lose him, Alara. I won't lose you." It was the first time he had used her name. It hung in the air between them, a fragile, beautiful thing. In that moment, he was not just her partner, not just her protector. He was a man who was willing to risk his life for her and her son. He pulled on his heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf around his face. He took a small pouch of tobacco and a handful of jerky. He looked at Leo, his face softening with a pained tenderness. Then he looked at Alara. "Keep him warm," he said. "Talk to him. Don't let him give up." He touched her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. His touch was not impersonal this time. It was a promise. Then he turned and walked out into the storm, disappearing into the swirling white chaos. Alara was alone. Alone with her dying son and the ghosts of the past. She sat by Leo's side, her hand on his chest, feeling the frantic flutter of his heart. She talked to him, her voice a low, steady stream of words. She told him stories of his father, of the brave and kind man he had been. She told him of the future they would have, of the spring that would come, of the horses they would ride. She sang him the lullabies her mother had sung to her. She poured all of her love, all of her hope, all of her strength into her voice. Trying to will him back to life, hours passed. The storm raged on. Leo's breathing grew weaker, more shallow. Despair began to creep in, a cold, dark tide. She was failing. She was not strong enough. She buried her face in the blankets and wept, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. She had lost Thomas. Now she was losing Leo. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. And then she felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up, her vision blurred with tears. It was Caleb. He was covered in snow, his face raw and red from the wind, but he was there. And behind him stood Dr. Miller, his face grim but determined. Caleb had made it. He had ridden through the heart of the blizzard, a mad, desperate ride. Fueled by a love he hadn't even known he possessed. He had brought back help. He had brought back hope. Dr. Miller worked quickly, his movements efficient and sure. He forced a tincture of quinine and herbs between Leo's lips. He listened to his chest with a stethoscope, his expression grave. "The infection is deep," he said, his voice low. "The next few hours will tell the tale." Caleb and Alara kept vigil, their shoulders touching as they sat by the cot. The silence in the cabin was no longer one of distance. It was one of shared prayer, of two hearts beating as one. They were a team, a family, united in their fight for the small boy, who was the center of their world. As the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gray, Leo's fever broke. His breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. Ilara touched his forehead. It was cool. She let out a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. Her body slumping against Caleb's, he put his arm around her, holding her tight, his own body trembling with exhaustion and emotion. She did not pull away. She leaned into his embrace, finding a strength and a comfort she had never expected to find. They had faced the storm, both outside and inside, and they had survived. They had fought for their family, and they had won. In the quiet aftermath of the blizzard, in the warmth of the small cabin, something new and beautiful had been born. It was not the passionate, fiery love of her youth with Thomas. It was something quieter, deeper, stronger. It was a love that had been forged in the crucible of hardship, tempered by loss, and sealed by a shared act of courage. It was the love of two broken souls who had found a way to heal each other, to make each other whole again. The spring came, and with it, a sense of renewal. The snow melted, revealing the green shoots of new life pushing through the dark, rich earth. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp soil, the sound of birdsong and the gurgle of the creek, now swollen with meltwater. It was a time of new beginnings, both for the land and for the small family that called it home. But their newfound peace was short-lived. A shadow from the past was about to fall over their small, sun-drenched valley. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was Silas Blackwood, and he was not alone. He was accompanied by the town sheriff, a hard-faced man with cold, empty eyes. They rode into the yard, their horses kicking up dust, their presence in immediate violation of the tranquility of the place. Silas dismounted, a look of triumphant malice on his face. He held up a piece of paper, a legal document from a circuit. "Judge in a town miles away. This is a court order," he announced, his voice dripping with false piety. "It declares your so-called marriage to this woman null and void." It was not sanctioned by a proper authority. It was a sham, a public spectacle of indecency. Ilara's heart stopped. She felt the blood drain from her face. She reached for Leo, pulling him behind her, her body a protective shield. "What do you want, Silas?" Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet, his body tense, his hand resting near the axe he had been using to split wood. "I want what is rightfully mine," Silas said, his eyes glittering with greed. "According to the law, as this woman's closest male relative by her late husband's blood, I am the legal guardian of her son." He pointed a bony finger at Leo. "The boy will come with me. He will learn the value of hard work. I have a place for him in the mines, a place of darkness and death, where boys younger than Leo were worked until their bodies gave out. It was a death sentence. Ilara let out a small, strangled cry. She would die before she let him take her son. "You will not touch him," Caleb said, his voice a low, menacing growl. He took a step forward, the axe now held loosely in his hand. The sheriff drew his pistol. "Don't be a fool, Thorne," he said, his voice flat. "This is the law. We are here to enforce it. The boy comes with us. The woman can stay or go. It's no matter to us." It was a trap, a cruel, calculated move to destroy them. Silas knew that Ilara would never leave her son. He was not just taking Leo. He was taking her too. He was reasserting his ownership, his control. He was taking back the property that Caleb had stolen from him. "There will be a hearing," the sheriff said, his eyes cold and hard. "In town, tomorrow at noon. The circuit judge is passing through. He will hear the case and make a final ruling. But until then, the boy is to be placed in the custody of Mr. Blackwood." "No!" Ilara screamed, her voice raw with desperation. She lunged forward, but Caleb caught her arm, his grip firm but gentle. "Not like this, Ilara," he whispered, his eyes blazing with a cold, controlled fury. "We will fight them. But we will do it our way." He looked at the sheriff, his gaze unwavering. "We will be there," he said. "Tomorrow at noon, but the boy stays with his mother tonight." The sheriff hesitated, his eyes flicking from Caleb's stony face to the axe in his hand. He knew Caleb was not a man to be trifled with. He had a reputation for being a quiet man, but also a dangerous one. After a long, tense moment, the sheriff nodded curtly. "Tomorrow at noon," he repeated. "Don't be late." Silas shot them a look of pure hatred, his face contorted in a frustrated sneer. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, the sheriff following close behind. They were gone, but the poison of their presence lingered in the air. Ilara collapsed to the ground, her body shaking with sobs. Leo ran to her, his small arms wrapping around her neck. "Don't let him take me, Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Never," Ilara said, her voice fierce with a mother's love. "I will never let him take you." Caleb knelt beside them, his hand resting on Leo's back. He looked at Ilara, his gray eyes filled with a grim determination. "We will not lose him," he said. "I swear it." That night, no one slept. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The threat of separation hung over them, a heavy, suffocating shroud. Ilara held Leo close, her body a warm, protective cocoon around him. Caleb sat at the table, his face illuminated by the flickering lamplight, his expression unreadable. He was staring at the small leather-bound journal that lay open before him, Sarah's journal. He had never spoken of her, of his past. He had kept his grief locked away, a private, sacred thing. But now, in the face of losing this new family he had found, the walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "She was my wife. We came here to build a life. We're going to have a son." He paused, his throat working. "The fever took them both. I buried them on the hill, under the big oak tree." He looked at Ilara, his eyes raw with a pain that was still as fresh as the day it had happened. "I thought my life was over. I thought I would die here, alone with their ghosts." He reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "And then you came," he whispered. "You and Leo, you brought life back to this place. You brought life back to me." Tears streamed down Ilara's face. She squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him, for his loss, for the love he had kept hidden for so long. "We are a family, Caleb," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You, me, and Leo, and we will not let them tear us apart." They sat like that for a long time, their hands clasped together, drawing strength from each other, Two broken souls united in their determination to fight for the love that had healed them. They had no money, no power, no influence. All they had was each other. And they knew, in the quiet, desperate hours before the dawn, that it would have to be enough. The town square was packed. It seemed every man, woman, and child from Prosperity Creek and the surrounding ranches had come to witness the spectacle. It was a trial, a public reckoning, and the stakes were the highest they could be: the fate of a child, the future of a family. The circuit judge, a stern white-haired man named Abernathy, sat at a makeshift bench, his face impassive. Silas stood on one side, flanked by his lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man from the city. On the other side stood Caleb and Alara. With Leo between them, his small hand clutching his mother's, they stood alone, without counsel, without allies. Silas's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and persuasive. He painted a picture of Alara as an unfit mother, a destitute widow who had entered into a shameful, godless union with a reclusive, violent man. He portrayed Caleb as a landless drifter with a mysterious, troubled past. He presented the court order, the legal documents, the cold, hard facts of the law. He spoke of Silas's Christian charity, his desire to provide his nephew with a stable, respectable home, to teach him the value of discipline and hard work. It was a masterful performance, a web of lies and half-truths woven together to create a compelling narrative of their unworthiness. The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of sympathy for Silas and suspicion towards Caleb and Alara. The weight of their judgment was a physical force, pressing down on Alara until she felt she could barely breathe. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the same faces that had watched her on the auction block, and she saw no hope, no compassion. Then it was Silas's turn to speak. He played the part of the grieving uncle, his voice thick with false emotion. He spoke of his love for his late nephew Thomas, his duty to protect his legacy. He spoke of his concern for Leo, for the boy's moral and spiritual well-being. He looked at the judge, his eyes shining with crocodile tears. "All I want is what's best for the boy," he said, his voice breaking. It was a sickening, brilliant performance. Alara could feel the tide of opinion turning against them. They were losing. The law was on Silas's side. The town was on his side. They had nothing. The judge turned to them, his expression grim. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice devoid of warmth, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Caleb stepped forward. He did not look at the judge. He looked at the people of Prosperity Creek. "I am not a man of many words," he began, his voice low but clear, carrying across the silent square. "I cannot match the fancy speeches of this lawyer. I cannot tell you what the law says. I can only tell you what is in my heart." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, meeting the eyes of the blacksmith, the doctor, the rancher who had sold him the cow. "You all know me. You know I keep to myself. You know I have ghosts." His voice faltered for a moment, and he glanced at Alara, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "But this woman," he said, his voice growing stronger, "this woman and her son, they are not my ghosts. They are my life. We have built a home together, not with money or with fancy words, but with our own two hands, with sweat and with respect. We are a family, and no piece of paper, no law made by men who do not know us, can change that." He turned to the judge, his gray eyes blazing with a quiet fire. "You can take the boy from us," he said. "You can tear our family apart, but you will not break us, because what we have is real. It was forged in hardship and in love, and it is stronger than any law you can write." He stepped back, his speech finished. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. His words, simple and honest, had struck a chord. They had seen the change in him, the way he had come back to life. They had seen the dignity with which Alara had carried herself, the way she had turned a desolate piece of land into a home. They had seen the love between the three of them, a love that was as real and as tangible as the dust under their feet. The judge looked at Alara. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice softer now, "do you have anything to add?" Alara stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never spoken in public before. She was a simple woman, a widow, a mother. But she knew, in that moment, that she had to find her voice. For Leo, for Caleb, for the family they had built. She did not look at the judge or the crowd. She looked at Silas. "You speak of what is best for the boy," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You speak of love and duty. But you know nothing of either." Her voice grew stronger, ringing with a righteous anger. "You left us to starve. You put me on a block and tried to sell me like cattle. You shamed me, you humiliated me, and you did it in the name of charity." She turned to the crowd, her eyes flashing. "You all watched," she said, her voice accusing. "You all stood by and did nothing." A murmur of shame rippled through the crowd. The women looked down at their feet. The men shuffled uncomfortably. "This man," she said, turning to Caleb and taking his hand, "this man, who had nothing, offered me everything. He did not offer me money. He offered me respect. He did not offer me pity. He offered me a partnership. He did not try to own me. He offered me freedom." She looked at the judge, her eyes shining with tears, but her voice was strong and steady. "We are not a family by law, Your Honor. We are a family by choice. We have chosen to love each other, to protect each other, to build a life together. And that is a law that is higher than any written in your books." She pulled Leo in front of her, her hands on his small shoulders. "This is my son," she said, her voice ringing with a fierce maternal pride. "And he will not be raised in the darkness of a mine. He will be raised in the light of the sun, on the land that we have healed together, by the two people who love him more than life itself." She finished, her chest heaving, her words hanging in the still hot air. The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence of awe, of respect, of a community that had been forced to look at itself in the mirror and had not liked what it saw. Then a voice called out from the back of the crowd, "She's right." It was Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's wife. She stepped forward, her face resolute. "I saw it. We all saw it. What Silas Blackwood did to this woman was a sin. And what Caleb Thorne did was an act of Christian charity, the truest I have ever witnessed." Another voice joined in. It was Dr. Miller. "I have seen this family," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. "I have seen their home. I have seen their love for that boy. And I tell you, there is no better place for him in all of this territory." One by one, others began to speak. The rancher, the general store owner, the lonely trapper. They spoke of Caleb's honor, of Elura's dignity, of the family they had become. The whispers of judgment had turned into a chorus of support. The town, which had once been their persecutor, had become their defender. Silas's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge waved him into silence. Judge Abernathy looked at Caleb and Alara, his stern face softened by a look of profound respect. He picked up the court order from his desk and in one swift movement, tore it in two. "The law is a blunt instrument," he said, his voice booming. "Across the square. It is meant to provide order, to protect the innocent. But sometimes the law is blind. And it is up to us, to the community, to open its eyes." He looked at Silas, his eyes cold with contempt. "This court finds no merit in your claim, Mr. Blackwood. Your petition for guardianship is denied." He then looked at Caleb and Alara, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "And as for your union," he said, "I may not be a preacher, but as a representative of the law in this territory, I believe I have the authority to rectify the situation." By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. Legally, officially, and for all time." A cheer went up from the crowd, a loud, joyous sound that echoed off the buildings and up into the clear blue sky. Ilara stared at the judge, then at Caleb, her heart so full it felt like it would burst. Caleb wrapped his arm around her, pulling her and Leo into a tight embrace. The three of them stood together, a small island of love in a sea of cheering faces, their battle won, their family whole. They had faced the final test, and they had not just survived. They had triumphed. They had fought for their family, for their love, for their right to exist. And in doing so, they had not only healed themselves, they had healed a community. They did not have a wedding feast or a celebration. Their victory was a quiet, private thing. They rode home, not as a desperate man and a bought woman, but as a husband and a wife, a family recognized by law and by heart. The sun was setting as they reached their valley, casting a warm golden glow over the land. The cabin, once a symbol of desolation, now looked like a beacon of hope, their home. That evening, they ate a simple meal of bread and stew, the three of them gathered around the small table. The silence was not one of pain or uncertainty, but of peace, of a deep and abiding contentment. After dinner, Caleb took Ilara's hand and led her outside. Leo followed, his small hand in Caleb's other hand. They walked up the small hill behind the cabin, to the big oak tree that stood like a silent sentinel, its branches reaching up to the star-dusted sky. Two small weathered stones lay at the base of the tree, Sarah, and a smaller one, with no name. Caleb knelt and gently touched the stones, his face filled with a quiet sorrow, but no longer the raw, all-consuming grief of before. "This is where they rest," he said, his voice soft. He looked at Ilara, his gray eyes shining in the moonlight. "I used to think this was a place of endings, but now I know it's a place of beginnings, too." He stood up and pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Leo snuggled between them, his head resting against his mother's stomach. They stood there for a long time, the three of them, under the vast, silent sky, the cool night air on their faces. The scars of their pasts were still there, etched into their souls like the lines on Caleb's face, but they were no longer open wounds. They were part of their story, the story of how they had found each other in the darkness and led each other into the light. They were not perfect. They were not unblemished. They were simply whole. They stood under the vast, silent sky, three broken souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other.